July 14, 1943, 8:47 hours. 2 miles east of Gela, Sicily. The Sherman's interior smells of hot metal, gun oil, and the sweat of 5 men packed into a space barely large enough for 3. Staff Sergeant Frank Audick peers through the periscope of his M4A1, watching the olive groves shimmer in the morning heat. The 2nd Armored Division's advance inland from the beachhead has been grinding forward for 3 days now, and Audick's crew, like every other tank crew in the division, hasn't slept more than a few hours since H-hour. Movement, 11 o'clock, calls out Corporal Jimmy Reeves from the bow gunner position, his voice crackling through the intercom. Could be infantry. Audick shifts his view. The Sicilian countryside unfolds before him in waves of yellow grass and twisted trees, deceptively peaceful except for the column of black smoke rising from a burning half-track somewhere to their rear. Then he sees it not infantry, but the low, angular silhouette of a German Panzer IV emerging from behind a stone farmhouse 400 yards away. Gunner, traverse left. Tank, 11 o'clock. Private Eddie Holbrook swings the 75mm gun around with practiced precision. In the loader's position, PFC Marcus Webb already has a high-explosive round in his hands. The hydraulic traverse winds. The German tank hasn't spotted them yet. It's moving laterally, probably repositioning after ambushing the vehicles to their rear. Identified, Holbrook says. Fire. The 75mm cannon roars. The Sherman rocks backward. Through the smoke and dust, Audick watches the tracer arc across the field. The round strikes low on the Panzer IV's hull. A hit, but no penetration. The German tank jerks to a halt. Its turret begins to rotate toward them with terrible, deliberate slowness. Load AP. Load AP. Audick's voice rises despite his training. They've got maybe 5 seconds before that long 75mm gun finds them. Webb slams another round home. Up. Fire. The second shot goes wide, kicking up dirt 3 feet to the right of the German tank. Audick's mouth goes dry. The Panzer IV's gun is pointing directly at them now. Time seems to stretch, every detail crystallizing with horrible clarity the way the sunlight glints off the German tank's mantlet, the small cloud of dust still settling from their missed shot, the smell of cordite thick in the crew compartment. The world explodes. The German's 75mm armor-piercing round hits the Sherman's right side with a sound like a sledgehammer striking a bell. The interior fills instantly with smoke, fire, and the screaming of men. Something shrapnel, fragments of the penetrator cuts through PFC Webb's shoulder. He falls backward against the turret basket, blood spreading across his shirt. But that's not what kills him. The German round has punched through the sponson, through the auxiliary ammunition rack mounted against the sidewall. 20 75mm shells are stored there, their brass casings gleaming in neat rows. When the German penetrator slashes through this storage, it doesn't detonate the shells themselves. The high explosive charges are relatively stable. Instead, it ignites the powder charges, the propellant bags attached to each round. What happens next occurs in less than 2 seconds, but for the men inside, it unfolds with nightmarish clarity. The propellant doesn't explode, it burns, furiously, releasing an instantaneous wave of superheated gas and flame. The fire spreads from shell to shell with terrible speed, engulfing the entire right side of the crew compartment. The temperature inside the tank spikes to over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the space between one heartbeat and the next. PFC Webb's scream cuts off abruptly. The ammunition continues to cook off, not in a catastrophic explosion, but in a sustained, roaring inferno that turns the Sherman's interior into a crematorium. Out. 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 Audick shoves Holbrook toward the turret hatch. The gunner scrambles up and through, his hands blistering on the hot metal. Audick follows, his lungs burning from the superheated air, his vision already narrowing from smoke and heat. In the driver's position, Sergeant Bill Kowalski and Corporal Reeves are trying to escape through the forward hatches, but the smoke is too thick, the flames too close. Audick tumbles off the tank onto the hot ground. Holbrook is already there, rolling in the dirt, trying to extinguish flames on his jacket. The Sherman, their home for the past 3 months, covered in the crew's personal belongings and good luck charms, is completely engulfed now. Black smoke pours from every hatch. The ammunition continues to cook off inside, sending jets of flame shooting from the turret opening. Kowalski appears at the driver's hatch, his face blackened, his hands clutching at the rim. He pulls himself halfway out, then stops. Just stops. His body goes slack and he slips back inside. Reeves never appears at all. The entire sequence, from penetration to Kowalski's death, has taken less than 20 seconds. Audick kneels in the dirt, watching his tank burn, listening to the ammunition pop and crack inside, and knows with absolute certainty what killed his men. Not the German round. Not the penetration itself. The fire. The goddamned fire. By the time the Sicilian campaign winds down 6 weeks later, the 2nd Armored Division has lost 41 Shermans to enemy action. Of those 41, 32 burned after penetration. Some crews got out. Many didn't. The statistics are becoming impossible to ignore, though the Army still doesn't advertise them to the public back home. The Sherman M4 has been in combat for less than a year, first blooded in North Africa in November 1942, and already it's acquiring a reputation that has nothing to do with its mechanical reliability or its excellent gun. Crews are calling it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company's advertising slogan, "Lights first time, every time." British tankers have their own nickname, the Tommy Cooker. The grim humour masks genuine terror. In the holding area behind the lines at Palermo, you can see it in the way replacement crews look at their assigned tanks. They walk around them slowly, running hands over the armor, checking the welds, examining the side sponsons where most of the ammunition is stored. They're trying to calculate their chances, doing mental math that doesn't add up to anything good. Technical Sergeant Robert Marsh, a tank maintenance officer with the 2nd Armored Ordnance Company, watches the replacements with something between pity and frustration. He's been tracking the division's tank losses since North Africa, maintaining detailed records that officially exist for maintenance purposes but that everyone knows serve a darker purpose. They're a casualty list, tank by tank, crew by crew. Marsh is 34 years old, older than most men in the division, a mechanic from Detroit who worked at the Chrysler plant before the war. He enlisted in 1940, when the Army was still using M3 Stuarts as its primary tank, before anyone had heard of the Sherman. He's good with his hands, good with machines, good at seeing how things fit together and where they break. That's why he's in Ordnance, why he's the one who examines damaged tanks when they're recovered from the field. It's why he's the one who started noticing the pattern. On August 18, 3 days before the Sicily campaign officially ends, Marsh stands in a salvage yard outside Palermo, looking at what remains of 7 Shermans destroyed in the last week of fighting. 5 are complete burnouts, their interiors gutted by fire, their paint blistered off, their hatches frozen open where crews tried desperately to escape. 1 has a massive hole in its turret from a catastrophic ammunition explosion, a rare occurrence, but spectacular when it happens. The last tank, surprisingly, is relatively intact despite a penetrating hit to the glacis. This one didn't burn. Marsh has been examining knocked-out Shermans since Kasserine Pass. He's developed a routine, a systematic approach. He starts with the point of penetration, measuring the hole, identifying the weapon type from the damage pattern. Then he traces the path of the penetrator through the interior, documenting what it hit, what it damaged, what it should have destroyed. The tank that didn't burn is his starting point. He climbs inside, his boots crunching on broken equipment and shell casings. The German round, probably an 88mm from the size of the entry hole, came through the front armor at a slight angle, punched through the transmission housing, and spent its energy in the lower hull. It missed the fuel tanks. It missed the ammunition storage completely. The crew bailed out with minor injuries. The tank was recovered and will probably be repaired and returned to service. Then Marsh examines the burnt-out tanks. Every single one was penetrated in or near the ammunition storage racks. The side sponsons, where the Sherman stores most of its 75mm ammunition, are the most common hit locations. Some were hit in the turret, where additional rounds are stored in the bustle. 1 was penetrated in the bow, where the assistant driver sits surrounded by even more ammunition. In every case, the fire started within seconds of penetration. In every case, the ammunition cooked off. In every case, the crew either died immediately or had less than 30 seconds to escape. Marsh kneels inside one of the burnt-out hulls, his hands covered in soot and ash that was once paint and rubber and, in some places, human tissue. The ammunition racks along the sponsons are empty now, their contents consumed by fire or blown clear by cooking off. He runs his fingers along the rack mounting, feeling where the metal has warped from heat, where the paint has bubbled and flaked away. This is where men die, he thinks. Right here, in these side racks, in this arrangement that puts 75 rounds of ammunition at perfect height for every German 75mm and 88mm gun in the theatre. He's not an engineer. He's not a designer. He's just a sergeant who fixes tanks. But he understands, with the clarity of someone who has spent 6 months looking at corpses in burnt-out metal boxes, that the Sherman's ammunition storage is a death sentence. The question is, what can be done about it? That evening, Marsh sits in the Ordnance Company's tent, writing a report he's not sure anyone will read. The report details his findings, includes sketches of penetration patterns, lists the percentage of knocked-out tanks that burned, 78% in the last month alone, up from 60% in North Africa. He describes, in careful technical language, how the Sherman's ammunition storage makes it uniquely vulnerable to catastrophic fire. He doesn't expect the report to go anywhere. He's a sergeant, and the Sherman is in full production. Over 40,000 have been built or are on order. The Army doesn't redesign tanks because a maintenance sergeant thinks there's a problem. The Army has ordnance experts, engineering boards, testing facilities. If there were a problem with the Sherman's ammunition storage, surely they would have caught it during development. But Marsh knows something the ordnance experts don't. He knows what it looks like inside a Sherman after the fire goes out. He knows the smell. He knows how to tell the difference between a crew that escaped and a crew that didn't, based on where the bodies are found relative to the hatches. He knows these things because he's the one who has to clean the tanks out before they're sent back for salvage. Someone has to fix this, he writes at the bottom of his report. Someone has to make these tanks safer, or we're going to lose a generation of men to fire. He signs the report, files it with the company clerk, and goes to bed, not knowing that his words have started a clock ticking. Not knowing that in 8 months, his observations will save thousands of lives. Not knowing that he's about to become the mechanic who made Shermans Fireproof. September 3, 1943. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Weaver of the Ordnance Department's Armored Fighting Vehicle Branch reads Technical Sergeant Marsh's report for the 3rd time, his coffee growing cold in its cup. Outside his office window, the September rain drums against the glass, and somewhere on the Proving Grounds test range, a new batch of Shermans is being put through its paces firing drills, obstacle courses, endurance runs. Standard tests, all of them. None of them involving what happens when an enemy round penetrates the crew compartment. Weaver is 52 years old, a veteran of the First World War who spent the interwar years in various ordnance postings, watching the Army's tank program stumble from one failed design to another. He was there when the M2 Medium proved too lightly armored. He was there when the M3 Lee, with its awkward sponson-mounted main gun, was recognized as a stopgap almost before production began. And he was there in 1941 when the M4 Sherman finally gave the Army what it needed, a reliable, producible, combat-effective medium tank. The Sherman works. That's the thing. It works beautifully. Its right radial engine is borrowed from aircraft production, meaning parts are plentiful. Its suspension is comfortable enough that crews can fight effectively even after long road marches. Its 75mm gun can kill any German tank currently in production, at least from the side or rear. The Sherman is mechanically reliable, easy to maintain, and most importantly Ford, Chrysler, American Locomotive, and half a dozen other manufacturers are churning them out at a rate that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. But according to Marsh's report, they're also burning their crews alive at an alarming rate. Weaver sets the report down and reaches for another file on his desk, this one containing casualty statistics from the Ordnance Department's own analysis section. The numbers match Marsh's observations almost exactly. In North Africa, 60 to 65% of Shermans knocked out by enemy fire subsequently burned. In Sicily, the rate climbed to nearly 80%. British reports from their Sherman units show similar patterns. The Germans, by contrast, lose approximately 18% of their tanks to post-penetration fire. Weaver knows why, of course. German tanks, the Panzer III, Panzer IV, even the new Tigers and Panthers store their ammunition low in the hull, beneath the turret basket, surrounded by fuel tanks that act as additional protection. The Sherman stores most of its ammunition in sponson racks mounted high on the sides of the hull, directly in line with the most likely penetration points. It's a design choice that made sense in 1941, when the Sherman was being developed. The side spansons provide easy access for the loader, speed up the rate of fire, and keep the ammunition away from the hot engine compartment at the rear. Nobody considered what would happen when those convenient, accessible ammunition racks became the first thing an enemy round hit after penetrating the armor. The problem is that fixing it means admitting there's a problem. And admitting there's a problem with the Sherman in September 1943, when the tank is finally in full production, when the invasion of Italy is underway, when plans for the cross-channel invasion are being finalized, when 49,000 Shermans are on order and thousands more are rolling off assembly lines every month. Admitting there's a problem now would be catastrophic. Weaver stares at Marsh's report, at the careful sketches of burn patterns and penetration angles, at the sergeant's handwritten note at the bottom. Someone has to fix this. He picks up his telephone and asks the operator to connect him to the armored board at Fort Knox. October 12, 1943. Fort Knox, Kentucky. Major William Creighton watches as the test crew climbs out of the Sherman, their faces flushed, their hands shaking slightly. They're all experienced tankers, volunteers for this particular experiment, and they all knew what to expect. That doesn't make it any easier. How long? Creighton asks. From penetration to bailout. The tank commander, a captain named Morton, pulls off his helmet and wipes sweat from his forehead despite the cool October air. 18 seconds. Maybe 20. The smoke gets so thick you can't see the hatches. Private Denison damn near got stuck in the loader's position. Creighton makes a note on his clipboard. This is the 4th test this week, the 12th since the armored board approved his testing protocol. Each test follows the same procedure. Place a Sherman on the range, load it with a full combat load of ammunition, and fire various German weapons at it from typical combat ranges. When penetration occurs, and it always occurs, because the tests are designed to achieve penetration, observe what happens inside. What happens inside is always the same: fire, smoke, and panic. The tests use special instrumentation to measure temperature, burn rates, and crew survivability. Cameras inside the tank capture everything. Thermocouples record the temperature spike. Stop-motion photography tracks how quickly the fire spreads from the point of penetration to the ammunition racks and throughout the crew compartment. The data is unambiguous and damning. When an armor-piercing round penetrates a Sherman side sponson, the most common hit location in combat, it takes an average of 1.3 seconds for the ammunition stored there to ignite. The resulting fire reaches 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit within 4 seconds. At this temperature, the crew has approximately 15 to 30 seconds to escape before incapacitation from heat, smoke inhalation, or burns. Crews attempting to fight the fire or retrieve wounded comrades almost never escape. The tests also reveal something else. The fire isn't caused by the shells exploding. High explosive rounds are remarkably stable. They require their fuses to detonate properly. What burns is the propellant, the powder charges that launch the shells. These charges are made of nitrocellulose, the same material used in smokeless powder for rifles. They're designed to burn quickly and completely. When an enemy round slashes through an ammunition rack, the propellant charges ignite almost instantly, and once started, the fire is nearly impossible to extinguish. Creighton has been an armor officer for 8 years, since graduating from West Point in 1935. He's studied tank warfare, read everything from JFC Fuller to Heinz Guderian, commanded tank platoons in peacetime maneuvers. He thought he understood armored combat. But these tests have taught him something no textbook covered. The real killer in tank warfare isn't the penetration itself. It's what happens in the seconds immediately after. We need to relocate the ammunition, he tells his staff that evening, spreading photographs of burnt-out Shermans across the conference table. Get it out of the spansons. Put it somewhere less vulnerable. Where? Asks Captain Lewis, the armored board's engineering liaison. The lower hull is full of transmission, drivetrain, fuel tanks. The engine compartment is even worse. The turret bustle is already at capacity. There's nowhere else to put 75 rounds of 75mm ammunition in a Sherman. Then we reduce the combat load. Carry fewer rounds, accept the trade-off. The crews won't accept it, Lewis says. They're already outgunned by Panthers and Tigers. You want to give them less ammunition. Creighton has no answer to that. He looks at the photographs again, the blackened hulls, the frozen hatches, the scatter pattern of equipment thrown clear by escaping crews. In one photo, you can see a tanker's personal effects on the ground beside a burnt-out Sherman, a wallet, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses melted into an unrecognizable lump, a letter from home with its edges charred but the address still visible. Someone's son died in that tank. Someone's husband, brother, father. There has to be a solution, Creighton says quietly. We're losing 70% of crews in knocked-out tanks. That's not acceptable. But acceptable or not, the problem remains. The Sherman's basic design puts ammunition exactly where enemy fire is most likely to hit it, and nobody knows how to change that without a complete redesign that would halt production and delay the war by months or even years. November 1943. 2nd Armored Division, staging in England. Technical Sergeant Robert Marsh receives his new assignment with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. He's being transferred from the 2nd Armored Division to a special Ordnance Detachment attached to the Armored Board. His specific role, Field Liaison for Ammunition Storage Modification Testing. The orders are vague, but the intent is clear enough. Someone read his report. Someone is actually trying to fix the problem. He ships out from Sicily in mid-November, arrives in the States on December 3rd, and reports to Fort Knox on December 8th, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor brought America into the war. The timing isn't lost on him. 2 years of war, and they're still trying to figure out how to keep their tankers from burning to death. Major Creighton meets him in the Armored Board's main building, a sprawling complex of offices and workshops that smell of gun oil and fresh paint. Creighton is younger than Marsh expected, maybe 32 or 33, with the trim bearing of a career officer and the tired eyes of someone who's been fighting bureaucracy as much as Germans. Your report from Sicily, Creighton says, shaking Marsh's hand. It was the first time someone laid out the fire problem in detail. Statistical analysis, technical observations, actual recommendations. Most after-action reports just say tank knocked out and move on. You described why they're being knocked out, why crews are dying. That matters. Marsh doesn't know what to say to that, so he says nothing. Creighton leads him through the building to a workshop where 3 Shermans are parked in various states of disassembly. Engineers and mechanics are swarming over them, pulling out ammunition racks, measuring hull spaces, arguing over drawings and specifications. We've been testing for 2 months, Creighton explains, trying to find solutions. The problem is that every solution creates new problems. Move the ammunition lower in the hull, you have to redesign the floor. Reduce the combat load, crews complain they don't have enough rounds. Add fire suppression systems, you add weight and complexity. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where every piece you move makes the rest stop fitting. He shows Marsh the test results, the temperature data, the burn rate calculations, the frame-by-frame photography of ammunition cooking off. Marsh has seen the aftermath of these fires in Sicily. Seeing them happen in real time, captured by high-speed cameras, is somehow worse. You can see exactly how fast it happens, how little time the crew has, how completely the fire consumes everything. We've tried wet storage systems, Creighton says, pulling out a sketch. Submerging the ammunition in water. The British tested something similar. Problem is, water leaks, evaporates, freezes in winter. Crews would have to constantly maintain it. And if the water leaks out before combat, you've got nothing protecting the ammunition. Marsh studies the sketch. The concept is simple. Surround the ammunition with water jackets that would absorb heat and prevent the propellant from igniting. But Creighton's right water is problematic. It's heavy, it requires constant maintenance, and it fails if the system is damaged or neglected. What about something other than water? Marsh asks. Like what? Something that doesn't evaporate, doesn't freeze. Something thick enough that it won't leak out easily even if the container is damaged. Creighton looks at him. You're thinking of a gel? A liquid that's viscous enough to stay in place. I'm thinking of something that works in Sicily in summer and Russia in winter. Something a crew can't accidentally drain or forget to refill. Something that's already liquid, already in the racks, ready to work the second an enemy round comes through. It's not a fully formed idea yet. Marsh is thinking out loud, drawing on his years as a mechanic, remembering how different fluids behave under different conditions. Motor oil stays liquid in cold weather if you use the right weight. Glycerin, used in hydraulic systems, resists freezing and doesn't evaporate. There are industrial fluids, lubricants, chemicals that might work. Creighton is nodding slowly. A permanent wet stowage system. Something that's always there, always ready, requiring no maintenance. Can we test it? We can test anything, Creighton says. The question is whether anyone will approve it for production. December 1943. Aberdeen Proving Ground. The testing begins with small-scale experiments. Marsh and Creighton work with the Aberdeen engineers to build test fixtures ammunition racks submerged in various fluids, subjected to high-velocity impacts from armor-piercing rounds. They try water first, as a baseline. Then mineral oil. Then various hydraulic fluids. Then glycerin. Glycerin works. The tests show that 75 mm ammunition submerged in glycerin, even when struck directly by an armor-piercing penetrator, takes significantly longer to ignite, sometimes doesn't ignite at all. The glycerin absorbs the heat from the penetrator, dissipates the thermal energy, and prevents the propellant from reaching its ignition temperature. Even when the ammunition does eventually catch fire, the burn rate is slower, giving crews precious additional seconds to escape. By January 1944, they have enough data to make a formal proposal. Retrofit all Sherman tanks with wet stowage ammunition racks surrounded by glycerin-filled jackets. The modification is remarkably simple. The racks are already there, they just need to be enclosed in sealed containers filled with glycerin. The ammunition sits in the glycerin. The glycerin does the rest. The cost is minimal. The weight penalty is acceptable. The complexity is low enough that field units can install it themselves. And the projected improvement in crew survival is dramatic. But getting the modification approved means navigating the same bureaucracy that spent 2 years ignoring the fire problem in the first place. It means convincing procurement officers, production managers, and army brass that it's worth disrupting the production schedule. It means overcoming institutional resistance to admitting that the Sherman, as currently designed, is killing American boys at an unacceptable rate. Marsh writes another report, this one co-authored with Creighton. It includes all their test data, detailed installation procedures, cost analyses, and projected casualty reductions. The report is 53 pages long and includes 16 photographs of test results showing ammunition surviving penetration when stored in glycerin. On the last page, Marsh writes, "This modification will save lives." That is not an opinion. That is a fact demonstrated by testing. The question is whether we will implement it in time to matter. He submits the report on January 28, 1944, 5 months before D-Day. Now all they can do is wait. February 15, 1944. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. The conference room on the 3rd floor of the War Department's newly constructed headquarters smells of cigarette smoke and floor wax. Technical Sergeant Marsh sits near the back of the room, uncomfortable in his Class A uniform, watching as Major Creighton sets up the presentation materials. 23 officers are seated around the long mahogany table, representatives from Ordnance, Armored Force, Army Ground Forces, and the Office of the Chief of Staff. These are the men who will decide whether wet stowage lives or dies as a concept. Marsh has been in the Army long enough to recognize a hostile audience. The officers aren't openly antagonistic, but their body language speaks volumes. Arms crossed. Skeptical expressions. The lieutenant colonel from Army Ground Forces keeps checking his watch, as if he has somewhere more important to be. The procurement officer from Detroit, a civilian $1-a-year man on loan from Chrysler, has barely looked up from his notes. Creighton begins with the statistics. 60 to 80% of knocked-out Shermans burn after penetration. Crew casualties in burning tanks exceed 90%. British tankers are refusing to crew Shermans without modification. Replacement training schools can't keep up with losses. The numbers are stark, undeniable, documented by after-action reports from 3 separate campaigns. "Gentlemen," Creighton says, his voice steady despite the tension in the room, "we are losing tanks we can replace. We are not losing crews we can replace. A Sherman costs $50,000 and takes 6 weeks to build. Training a tank crew takes 6 months and costs considerably more in human terms. When a crew burns, We lose 5 trained men plus the institutional knowledge they've accumulated in combat. The wet stowage modification addresses this directly. He shows the test footage. On a portable screen at the front of the room, the officers watch as an armor-piercing round slams into a Sherman sponson. In the control test, standard ammunition storage fire erupts within seconds. The temperature gauges spike. Smoke fills the crew compartment. In the wet stowage test, the same penetration produces minimal fire. The ammunition smolders but doesn't ignite fully. The temperature remains survivable for nearly 2 minutes. The modification reduces catastrophic fires by approximately 80%, Creighton continues. Cost per tank is $73 in materials. Installation time is 4 hours per tank. Weight penalty is negligible, roughly 200 pounds, well within acceptable limits. The glycerin is stable from -40 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit, requires no maintenance, and cannot be accidentally drained or removed by crews. The procurement officer from Chrysler finally looks up. You're asking us to modify the production line. That means retooling, retraining workers, disrupting the current output schedule. We're producing over 2,000 Shermans a month across all manufacturers. Any disruption risks delaying deliveries to units preparing for the cross-channel invasion. The modification can be implemented gradually, Creighton responds. Retrofit existing tanks in the field while new production incorporates wet stowage from the factory. The installation is simple enough that ordnance companies can handle it with standard tools. Simple for ordnance companies in the States, the Lieutenant Colonel from Army Ground Forces interjects. What about units in England? In Italy? In the Pacific? You're asking combat units to pull their tanks out of service for 4 hours per vehicle for a modification that addresses a problem we've lived with for 2 years. That's operational capacity we can't afford to lose, Major. Marsh watches Creighton's jaw tighten slightly. The Major has prepared for these objections, has answers for all of them, but Marsh can see the fundamental problem. The officers around this table don't want to be convinced. They want reasons to say no, because saying yes means admitting the Sherman has a fatal flaw, and admitting that means questions about why it wasn't addressed earlier, why thousands of men have already died in fires that might have been preventable. Sir, Creighton says carefully, with respect, we haven't lived with this problem. Our crews have died with it. 70% of tankers in knocked-out Shermans don't survive the fire. That's not an operational statistic. That's a casualty rate that will devastate our armored units if it continues. The room falls silent. The Lieutenant Colonel's face reddens slightly. The procurement officer makes a note. At the head of the table, a Brigadier General, the senior officer present, leans back in his chair and regards Creighton with an expression that might be sympathy or irritation. Major, the general says quietly, nobody in this room is unaware of the casualties. Nobody is dismissing the human cost. But we have an invasion scheduled for spring. We have armored divisions that need equipment now, not 6 months from now after we've modified every tank in the inventory. What you're proposing is a solution that helps future crews. What about the men who are going to hit the beaches in Normandy? Creighton glances back at Marsh, a brief look that carries a clear message. This is where we need help. Marsh stands, not quite sure what he's going to say, knowing only that someone has to make these officers understand what the statistics mean in human terms. General, sirs, Marsh begins, his voice rougher than Creighton's academy-trained tone. I've pulled bodies out of burned Shermans. Sicily, North Africa, Italy. I've done it enough times that I can tell you exactly what it looks like when a crew doesn't get out. When the loader is found in his station because the smoke got too thick to see the turret hatch. When the driver is halfway out the forward hatch because his legs stopped working from the heat. When there's nothing left in the assistant driver's position except his dog tags because everything else burned. The room has gone very quiet. The Lieutenant Colonel has stopped looking at his watch. You're right that we can't retrofit every tank before the invasion, Marsh continues. But we can start now. We can equip the tanks going to replacement units. We can prioritize the modification for units in England. And we can send the installation kits forward so that when tanks get knocked out and recovered, the ordnance companies can install wet stowage before they're sent back to combat. Some crews will still die in fires. But fewer will. That's worth disrupting a production schedule for. That's worth $73 per tank. He sits down, aware that he's just contradicted a general officer, aware that he's stepped far outside the bounds of what a technical sergeant should say in a meeting like this, aware that his career might have just ended. But he's also aware that everything he said is true, and that someone had to say it. The Brigadier General studies Marsh for a long moment, then looks at Creighton. Major, you guarantee this modification works? You guarantee it reduces fire casualties? Yes, sir. Our testing is conclusive. And it can be implemented without significantly impacting production. Yes, sir. We've coordinated with all major manufacturers. Chrysler, Ford, American Locomotive AVE all reviewed the specifications. It's a minor modification to their production process. The general nods slowly. He looks around the table at the other officers, measuring their reactions. Gentlemen, I don't like the idea of admitting we've had a problem with the Sherman any more than you do. But I like the idea of preventable casualties even less. The modification is approved for immediate implementation. New production gets wet stowage starting March 1st. Retrofit kits will be manufactured and sent to all theaters. Priority goes to unit staging in England. Questions? There are no questions. The meeting ends 5 minutes later with a flurry of administrative details and assigned action items. As the officers file out, the Brigadier General stops beside Marsh. "Sergeant," he says quietly, "that was either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. But it needed saying. Your war might have just saved a lot of lives." Marsh doesn't feel brave. He feels exhausted. "Sir, I just want crews to come home." "Don't we all?" the general says, and leaves. March 8, 1944. Chrysler Tank Arsenal, Detroit, Michigan. The production line stretches nearly a quarter-mile through the massive factory building, a river of steel and machinery flowing from bare hulls to completed tanks. Every 90 minutes, a finished Sherman rolls off the end of the line, painted olive drab, fitted with tracks, loaded with its initial supplies, ready for shipment to a port and then overseas to war. Today, the line has been stopped for 4 hours. Marsh stands near Station 18, where the ammunition racks are installed, watching as engineers explain the wet stowage modification to the production workers. The workers, mostly women, as so many factory jobs now, are listening carefully, taking notes, asking practical questions about assembly procedures and quality control. These are the people who will actually build the modification into every new Sherman. Their understanding, their precision, matters more than any general's approval. The glycerin containers are pre-filled, the lead engineer explains, holding up one of the new storage racks. It looks almost identical to the old design, except for the sealed jackets surrounding the ammunition wells. You install them exactly like the old rack, same mounting points, same hardware. The only difference is that you don't open these containers. The glycerin stays sealed inside. If you see leakage during installation, reject the unit and grab a replacement from the quality control station. A worker raises her hand. What if glycerin gets on our hands? Is it dangerous? It's harmless. Food-grade glycerin, same as what's used in medicines and cosmetics. Wash it off if you want, but it won't hurt you. The questions continue for another 20 minutes. Marsh is impressed by how thorough the workers are, how seriously they take the modification. They understand, perhaps better than the officers in Washington, that their work directly affects whether some soldier, some 19-year-old kid from Iowa or Georgia or New York, lives or dies when his tank gets hit. The responsibility shows in their careful questions, their detailed notes, their insistence on understanding every aspect of the new procedure. Production resumes at 2 p.m. hours. The line moves again. Hulls progress from station to station. And at Station 18, the new wet stowage racks are installed, one tank at a time, each rack filled with glycerin, each seal checked and verified. The first Sherman with wet stowage rolls off the Detroit line at 16:32 hours, March 8, 1944. By the end of the week, every Sherman produced in Detroit incorporates the modification. By the end of the month, all 5 major production facilities have implemented wet stowage. The cost in production time, 6 hours total. The cost in output, 0 tanks. The cost in modifications, $73 per tank. The cost in lives saved, incalculable. April 22, 1944. Southampton, England. The tank park outside Southampton holds over 300 Shermans, all waiting for shipment to units preparing for the invasion of France. Rain hammers down on the neat rows of tanks, running off their sloped hulls, turning the ground into thick mud that sucks at the boots of the men working among them. Technical Sergeant Marsh, now officially assigned to the European Theatre of Operations as a special ordnance liaison, walks between the rows with a clipboard, checking serial numbers, verifying which tanks have wet stowage and which need retrofitting. About 60% of the tanks here have the factory-installed modification. The rest were built before March and need retrofit kits. The kits arrived from the States 2 weeks ago, thousands of them packed in wooden crates, each kit containing everything needed to convert a Sherman to wet stowage: the new racks, the glycerin containers, installation hardware, and detailed instructions. The ordnance companies are working around the clock. Each tank takes 4 hours to retrofit, pull out the old ammunition racks, install the new ones, fill them with glycerin, test the seals, reinstall the ammunition. It's not complicated work, but it requires care and precision. A leak in the glycerin system means a rack that won't protect its ammunition. A poorly sealed container means glycerin draining out over time, leaving the crew with standard storage and no protection. Marsh supervises the work personally, moving from tank to tank, checking installations, answering questions. The ordnance mechanics are good at their jobs, but this is new to them, and they need someone who understands not just how to install the modification but why it matters. Sergeant Marsh. He turns to find a young lieutenant, maybe 23 years old, standing in the rain without seeming to notice it. The lieutenant's insignia marks him as armor, and his boots are caked with the red mud of the tank park. "Sir." "I'm Lieutenant James Garner, B Company, 2nd Battalion, 66th Armor. My platoon is receiving Shermans from this park next week. I heard you're the man who designed the wet stowage system." "I helped test it," Marsh corrects. "Major Creighton and the engineers at Aberdeen did most of the actual design work." "But you're the one who figured out the problem? Who documented it?" "I documented it. A lot of people figured out the problem. They just didn't know what to do about it." Garner nods, rain dripping from his helmet. "My crews are terrified, Sergeant. They've heard the stories from Sicily and Italy. They know about the fires. Some of them have requested transfers to infantry, if you can believe that. Infantry, where the life expectancy is worse, because at least in the infantry you don't burn." Marsh looks at the young officer, sees the weight he's carrying, the responsibility for those frightened crews, the knowledge that is going to lead them into combat, that some of them won't come back. "The wet stowage works, Lieutenant. It's not perfect. If you take a penetrating hit, you might still get a fire, but your crew will have time to bail out. That's what we've bought you, time." "How much time?" "In the tests. Usually between 90 seconds and 2 minutes before the heat becomes unsurvivable. That's versus 15 to 30 seconds with standard storage. It's enough time for everyone to get out if they move fast and don't panic." "What should I tell my crews?" Marsh considers the question. He could give the technical explanation, cite the test data, describe the thermal dynamics of glycerin-cooled ammunition storage. But that's not what Garner is asking for. "Tell them the Army finally listened," Marsh says. "Tell them someone figured out why Shermans were burning and fixed it. Tell them they're getting tanks that are as safe as we know how to make them. And tell them that if they do take a hit, they need to bail out immediately. Don't try to save the tank. Don't try to fight the fire. Just get out. The tank can be replaced. They can't." Garner salutes, a formal gesture that seems oddly appropriate in the rain and mud of the tank park. "Thank you, Sergeant, for caring enough to fix it." He walks away before Marsh can respond. Marsh watches him go, thinking about the crews Garner will lead, the battles they'll fight, the hits some of their tanks will inevitably take. He wonders how many of them will survive because of wet stowage. He wonders how many would have died without it. There's no way to know. You can't measure lives saved, only lives lost. But somewhere in France, in the weeks and months to come, men will bail out of penetrated Shermans, will stumble away from tanks that are burning but not yet crematoriums, will live to fight another day or go home after the war. And they'll never know that a mechanic from Detroit spent 6 months looking at burned tanks in Sicily and decided someone had to fix the problem. June 6, 1944. 6:45 hours. Omaha Beach, Normandy. Staff Sergeant Frank Audick recovered from his wounds in Sicily, promoted, and assigned to a new tank with a new crew watches the French coastline materialize through the pre-dawn gloom. His Sherman is still on the landing craft, engine idling, the smell of exhaust mixing with salt spray and the acrid smoke from the naval bombardment. Around him, 30 other Shermans are packed onto similar craft, waiting for the ramp to drop, waiting to drive into the water and onto the beach and into whatever hell the Germans have prepared. Audick has been in combat for nearly a year now. He's seen 3 different crews, lost 2 tanks, and spent 4 weeks in a hospital in England recovering from burns suffered when his first Sherman died in Sicily. The new tank under him, fresh from the factory with a build date of April 1944, has something his old tank didn't: wet stowage. The Ordnance Sergeant who delivered the tank explained it to him. Ammunition stored in glycerin. Fire suppression built into the storage system. Better chance of survival if they take a penetrating hit. Audick listened, nodded, and tried to feel reassured. But he remembers the fire in Sicily too clearly: the heat, the smoke, the way time seemed to stop when he couldn't find the hatch. Wet stowage or not, he knows what happens when a Sherman gets penetrated. The landing craft's ramp drops with a metallic crash. Cold water floods in, waist deep, shockingly cold despite it being June. The Sherman's waterproofing holds. The engine roars. They roll forward, off the ramp, into the surf, driving through water that reaches halfway up the hull. Audick can't see much through the periscope spray, smoke, the dark shapes of other tanks, the beach ahead shrouded in smoke and explosions. They make it to the beach. The Sherman's tracks bite into wet sand, then firmer ground. They're moving inland now, following the tanks ahead of them, looking for the exits off the beach. Artillery is falling around them, geysers of sand and smoke. Machine gun fire rattles off the hull like hail. Through the periscope, Audick sees bodies on the beach, sees burning vehicles, sees the chaos of the invasion's first terrible hours. Gunner, target, pillbox, 11 o'clock, he calls into the intercom. The 75mm cannon responds, the familiar recoil rocking the tank. The pillbox disappears in smoke and debris. They keep moving, firing at targets of opportunity, trying to support the infantry struggling up the beach. At 7:23 hours, a German 75mm anti-tank gun hidden in the bluffs above the beach finds their range. The round hits the Sherman's right sponson with the sound Audick has heard in nightmares for 11 months. For a moment that seems to stretch forever, he waits for the fire, for the heat, for the smoke that means they have seconds to live. The fire doesn't come. There's smoke, yes, and the cabin fills with the acrid smell of burned propellant. But it's not the instant inferno he remembers from Sicily. He can see. He can breathe. Through the haze, he sees his loader, PFC Sanders, looking around in confusion, clearly expecting worse. Damage report. Audick barks. Penetration right side, his driver responds. Losing hydraulic pressure, but we're still mobile. Can we fight? Guns operational. The smoke is clearing now. Whatever happened, whatever the German round hit, it didn't start a catastrophic fire. The ammunition in the sponson rack stored in wet stowage, surrounded by glycerin, absorbed the hit without igniting fully. The fire that did start was small, manageable, already dying out as the glycerin and the lack of oxygen did their work. They fought their tank off the beach. They fought it inland to the rally point. And when Ordnance finally examined the damage 3 days later, they found a German armor-piercing round lodged in the sponson ammunition rack, surrounded by scorched but largely intact 75mm shells, the glycerin container breached but having done its job. "You're lucky," the ordnance officer told Audick. "Another 6 inches to the left, different angle, and that round might have hit something vital." But Audick knows it wasn't luck. It was wet stowage. It was a mechanic in Sicily who documented a problem. It was engineers who designed a solution. It was factory workers in Detroit who installed the modification. It was the Army finally admitting that Shermans burned too easily and doing something about it. He doesn't know any of those people. He'll never meet Robert Marsh, We'll never know the man's name or his story. But he's alive because of them, and so is his crew, and somewhere in France that summer, thousands of other tankers are surviving penetrating hits that would have killed them 6 months earlier. The wet stowage is working. August 17, 1944. Near Falaise, France. The data starts coming in 6 weeks after D-Day, and it's undeniable. Major William Creighton sits in a commandeered farmhouse 20 miles behind the front lines, reviewing casualty reports from the Normandy campaign. The numbers are still preliminary, the battle is ongoing. Units are scattered, comprehensive after-action reports won't be compiled for months. But the pattern is already clear enough to make him set down his coffee cup and read the figures twice to be certain he isn't misinterpreting them. Of the 348 Shermans equipped with wet stowage that have been knocked out by enemy action since June 6, only 47 suffered catastrophic fires. That's 13.5%. The remaining 301 tanks were either recovered for repair or abandoned without burning, their crews escaping with survivable injuries or no injuries at all. Of the 193 Shermans without wet stowage knocked out in the same period, older tanks still in service. Tanks that hadn't received retrofit kits before deployment, 147 burned after penetration. That's 76%. The modification is working exactly as tested. Better, even. In the chaos of actual combat, with crews under fire and Germans counterattacking and artillery falling, wet stowage is giving men the time they need to escape. 90 seconds, 2 minutes, sometimes longer, enough time to think, to move, to help a wounded comrade out of the tank, to live. Creighton pulls out a fresh sheet of paper and begins drafting a report to the Ordnance Department. The report will include these statistics, will compare them to pre-modification casualty rates, will demonstrate conclusively that wet stowage has reduced Sherman fire casualties by approximately 80%. It will be dry, technical, professional, exactly the kind of document the Army requires. But as he writes, Creighton finds himself thinking not in terms of percentages but in terms of names. Somewhere in the 301 tanks that didn't burn are crews who went home after the war. Somewhere in those statistics are men who saw their children grow up, who returned to civilian jobs, who lived long lives because a mechanic noticed a pattern and an army that usually moved at glacial speed actually listened. He wishes he could know their names. All of them. Every man who bailed out of a penetrated Sherman, who smelled smoke and felt heat but had time to reach the hatch, who stumbled away from a tank that was burning but not yet an inferno. Every man who lived because someone cared enough to fix a problem. The report takes 3 hours to write. When it's finished, Creighton signs it, dates it, and adds it to the outgoing mail. Then he walks outside into the August evening, listening to the distant rumble of artillery, watching smoke rise from fires burning somewhere to the east. Somewhere out there, Technical Sergeant Robert Marsh is still working, still examining knocked-out tanks, still documenting damage patterns, still looking for ways to keep crews alive. Creighton hasn't seen him since England, but he knows Marsh is forward with one of the armoured divisions, doing the same work he was doing in Sicily. Documenting, observing, caring when it would be easier not to. Major Creighton. He turns to find a young corporal with a message. "Sir, you have a visitor," says his from the 2nd Armoured Division. The visitor is Frank Audick, now wearing staff sergeant stripes, his face tanned and weathered, his eyes carrying the particular weariness of men who have seen too much combat in too short a time. Creighton recognizes him from the casualty reports, one of the Omaha Beach survivors, one of the tankers whose Sherman took a penetrating hit and didn't burn. "Major," Audick says, saluting. "I heard you were here. I wanted to thank you for the wet stowage. My crew would be dead without it." Creighton returns the salute. "I didn't design it alone, Sergeant. And I'm not the one you should be thanking." "Who should I thank?" "A mechanic named Marsh. Technical Sergeant Robert Marsh. He's the one who figured out why Shermans were burning. He documented it, pushed for a solution, wouldn't let the problem be ignored. Everything else, the testing, the design, the production implementation, that all followed from his work." Audick nods slowly. "Is he here? Can I meet him?" He's forward with the 3rd Armoured, examining knocked-out tanks near Argentan. "But I'll make sure he knows you asked. I'll make sure he knows his work mattered." After Audick leaves, Creighton sits down and writes a second letter, this one personal rather than official. He addresses it to Technical Sergeant Robert Marsh, care of 3rd Armored Division, and in it he describes the statistics, the casualty reductions, the crews who survived because of wet stowage. He describes meeting Audick, describes the gratitude in the man's eyes, describes what it means to save lives on this scale. "You did this," Creighton writes at the end of the letter. "You saw a problem everyone else had accepted as inevitable. You documented it when it would have been easier to look away. You pushed for a solution when you had no authority to demand one. You saved thousands of lives, Robert. Thousands. Most of them will never know your name. But I know. And it matters." He seals the letter, sends it forward with the next supply convoy, and hopes it reaches Marsh somewhere in the chaos of the French campaign. November 12, 1944. Nancy, France. Robert Marsh stands in yet another salvage yard, examining yet another knocked-out Sherman. This one took an 88mm round through the turret. Catastrophic damage, the entire turret ring blown apart, 2 crew members killed instantly by the penetration itself. But the tank didn't burn. The ammunition in the wet stowage sponson racks remained intact. The driver and assistant driver escaped unharmed. Marsh has examined over 200 knocked-out Shermans since D-Day. He's developed a new routine, a new set of documentation procedures. For each tank, he records point of penetration, ammunition storage condition, where the fire occurred, crew casualties, time from penetration to evacuation. The data feeds into his reports, into the Army's growing understanding of how wet stowage performs in actual combat conditions. The statistics tell a story that's almost miraculous. In the 5 months since D-Day, Sherman fire casualties have dropped from approximately 70% to 15%. Crew survival rates in knocked-out tanks have increased proportionally. The modification is saving roughly 300 American lives per month, 600 per year if the war continues that long. But Marsh doesn't think in those terms. He thinks in terms of the individual crews, the individual men. Like the driver of this particular Sherman, a kid named Morrison from Tennessee, who crawled out of his hatch after the turret was destroyed and helped pull the bowgunner out with him. Morrison will go home after the war, Marsh thinks. He'll see Tennessee again. He'll have a life. Sergeant Marsh. He turns to find a lieutenant colonel he doesn't recognize, accompanied by a photographer and a signal corps officer with camera equipment. The lieutenant colonel extends his hand. "Sir," Marsh says, confused. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Davies from Theatre Headquarters. We're doing a feature for Stars and Stripes on the wet stowage modification. Major Creighton suggested we interview you. Said you were the originator of the concept." Marsh shakes his head. "Major Creighton and the engineers at Aberdeen designed it. I just documented the problem." Major Creighton says that's not true. He says you saw what everyone else was ignoring, that you pushed for a solution when it would have been easier to file a report and move on. "The Army wants to recognize your contribution, Sergeant. This modification has saved thousands of lives." The photographer is already setting up, positioning Marsh beside the knocked-out Sherman for dramatic effect. The signal corps officer is checking light levels. Davies is pulling out a notepad, preparing questions for the interview. Marsh feels deeply uncomfortable with all of it. He's not the hero of this story. The heroes are the men like Morrison who crawled out of destroyed tanks and kept fighting. The heroes are the factory workers in Detroit who installed wet stowage racks with precision and care. The heroes are the crews who trusted that the modification would work and kept crewing Shermans despite their fear. But Davies is insistent, and there's apparently no refusing a direct request from theatre headquarters. So Marsh stands beside the burned Sherman and answers questions about how he noticed the fire problem, how he documented it, how the solution was developed. The photographer takes pictures. The signal corps officer records his answers on film. The feature runs in Stars and Stripes 3 weeks later. It's a half-page spread with the headline, "Sergeant's Invention Saves Tank Crews." The article describes wet stowage, includes Marsh's photograph, quotes him extensively about the importance of crew survival. It makes him sound like a genius inventor rather than a mechanic who noticed a pattern. Marsh receives 73 letters in the month after the article publishes. Some are from tankers thanking him for the modification. Some are from families of men who survived knockouts, expressing gratitude that Marsh will never feel his earned. One is from the mother of PFC Marcus Webb, the loader who died in Marsh's original Sherman in Sicily. She writes that she's grateful other mothers won't lose their sons the way she lost hers, that Webb's death at least led to something that might save others. That letter destroys Marsh. He reads it 3 times, then folds it carefully and puts it in his jacket pocket. He carries it with him for the rest of the war, a reminder of why the work matters, why he spent 6 months examining burned tanks, why he pushed for a solution even when it seemed hopeless. Webb died because the Sherman's ammunition storage was vulnerable. Thousands of others lived because someone fixed it. That's not redemption. Webb is still dead, along with Kowalski and Reeves and all the others who burned before wet stowage was implemented. But it's something. It's the knowledge that their deaths weren't completely meaningless, that something was learned, that changes were made. May 8, 1945. VE Day. Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. The war in Europe ends on a Tuesday. Technical Sergeant Robert Marsh receives the news while examining a Panther tank knocked out by American Shermans 2 days before the ceasefire. The German tank has 3 penetrations, 2 in the side armor, 1 in the rear. All 3 were killing hits. The crew apparently died before they could bail out. Marsh has spent the entire war looking at knocked-out tanks, documenting how men die in armored combat. Now, suddenly, there are no more tanks being knocked out, no more crews dying, no more need for his particular expertise. The war is over. Europe is liberated. The killing has stopped. He should feel relief. Instead, he feels exhausted and strangely hollow. Final statistics won't be compiled for months, but the preliminary numbers are clear. Wet stowage, implemented across the entire Sherman fleet by late 1944, reduced fire casualties from approximately 70% to 15%. Over the course of the war, roughly 4,200 American tank crewmen survived knocked-out Shermans who would have died without the modification. That's 4,200 men who went home, who saw their families again, who lived. Marsh tries to feel satisfied with that number. 4,000 lives. It should be enough. It should feel like success. But he keeps thinking about the men who died before wet stowage was implemented. Webb, Kowalski, Reeves. The 32 crews the 2nd Armored lost to fire in Sicily. The hundreds more lost in North Africa, Italy, Normandy before the modification reached the front lines. They died in fires that wet stowage might have prevented, if only someone had recognized the problem earlier, if only the solution had been implemented faster. You can't save everyone. Marsh knows that. War kills people, and no modification, no matter how effective, can change that fundamental reality. But he also knows that every man who died in a Sherman fire before mid-1944 died unnecessarily. Died because the army was slow to recognize a problem and slower to fix it. That knowledge will stay with him forever. October 1945. Detroit, Michigan. Robert Marsh musters out of the Army on October 12, 1945, 5 months after VE Day. He returns to Detroit, to his old job at the Chrysler plant, to a civilian life that feels strange and disconnected after 5 years in uniform. The city is celebrating, everyone jubilant about victory and peace and the boys coming home. Marsh tries to share in the joy. Mostly, he feels tired. He never receives an official commendation for wet stowage. There's no medal, no ceremony, no formal recognition from the Army. The work he did was important, but it was also just one small piece of a massive war effort involving millions of people doing millions of jobs. The Army doesn't hand out medals for noticing things and writing reports. That's fine. Marsh didn't do it for recognition anyway. What he does receive, over the years that follow, are occasional letters from former tankers. Men who served in Shermans, who survived knockouts, who heard about wet stowage and tracked down his address through veteran networks. They write to say thank you, to describe the day their tank was hit and didn't burn, to express gratitude that Marsh will never feel he deserves. He keeps the letters in a box in his basement. By 1950, there are over 100. By 1960, over 200. Each one represents a life saved, a family kept whole, a man who came home. On quiet evenings, Marsh sometimes takes out the box and reads through the letters. He reads about the tanker who became a teacher in Ohio, whose students never knew he survived a German 88mm round in 1944. He reads about the sergeant who returned to his farm in Kansas, who named his son after the crewman who helped pull him from a burning Sherman. He reads about the lieutenant who became a doctor, who spent his career saving lives because his own life was saved by wet stowage. These men lived because a mechanic in Sicily noticed that Shermans burned too easily and decided someone had to fix it. They lived because the army, for once, listened. They lived because factory workers in Detroit installed modification kits with care and precision. They lived because engineers designed a solution and testing officers proved it worked and procurement officers approved it for production. They lived because, sometimes, in the middle of a war that killed millions, people managed to do something right. Robert Marsh died in 1977, at the age of 68, never having spoken publicly about his role in developing wet stowage beyond that single Stars and Stripes interview in 1944. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned that he was a World War II veteran who worked at Chrysler for 35 years. It didn't mention the 4,000 lives he saved. But somewhere in America, on the day Marsh died, there were 4,000 men still living who owed their lives to a mechanic who cared enough to document a problem, who pushed for a solution when it would have been easier to look away, who spent 6 months in salvage yards examining burned tanks so that fewer men would burn in the future. They never knew his name. But they lived. And in the end, that's what mattered.